50 million people died in 7 years. Half of everyone you knew, gone. The Black Death of 1346 to 1353 didn't just kill people. It murdered the medieval world and gave birth to modernity itself. Every freedom you take for granted, every scientific breakthrough, every social revolution of the past 600 years traces its roots back to those 7 years of unimaginable horror. But here's the question that will haunt you. What if the rats never came? What if the ships carrying Yersinia pestes had sunk in storms before reaching European shores? What if Europe's population had continued growing, unchecked, for another century? Close your eyes and imagine a world where 50 million people lived, loved, had children, and those children had children. A world where feudalism never weakened, where the Renaissance never ignited, where the Reformation might never have fractured Christianity. This isn't just alternative history. This is a glimpse into a world that was 99.9% of the way to happening. One change in wind direction, one storm at sea, one different trade route, and everything you know about the modern world vanishes like smoke. To understand what we lost, or rather, what we never gained, we must first travel back to 1345. Europe is suffocating under its own success. The medieval warm period has blessed the continent with unprecedented harvests for nearly 3 centuries. The population has exploded from perhaps 30 million in the year 1000 to over 75 million by 1340. Every arable piece of land is under cultivation. Forests that had stood since Roman times have been cleared for farming. Villages dot the landscape like stars in the night sky, each one packed with families living in conditions we would consider uninhabitable. The feudal system has created a rigid hierarchy that has lasted 400 years. Peasants are born, live, and die on the same land their great-great-grandparents worked. Social mobility is virtually non-existent. The Catholic Church controls not just spiritual life, but education, law, and often politics. Literacy is the privilege of clergy and nobility. Science is still shackled to Aristotelian philosophy and church doctrine. This is a world frozen in time, seemingly eternal, unchanging, and about to be shattered forever. Or is it? October 1347. This is the moment where our timeline splits. In our history, Genoese trading ships fleeing the Mongol siege of Kaffa arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily, bringing with them black rats and the fleas that carried doom. Within days, the plague begins spreading through the Mediterranean. But imagine instead a storm, a massive autumn tempest that scattered the Genoese fleet, sending every plague-carrying ship to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Or perhaps the Mongols never contracted the plague in the first place, never catapulted infected corpses over Kaffa's walls, never forced the Genoese to flee. Or imagine that the bacterium Yersinia pestes, which requires very specific temperature and humidity conditions to spread efficiently through flea populations, encountered an unusually cold and dry year that prevented its transmission. Any one of these scenarios, each entirely plausible, and the Black Death never reaches Europe. The ships that would have carried apocalypse instead arrive carrying only silk, spices, and news from the East. European merchants go about their business. Farmers harvest their crops. Mothers tuck their children into bed, unaware that in another timeline, half of them would be dead within a year. History holds its breath, and then continues on a completely different path. Without the Black Death, Europe's population doesn't collapse, it continues growing. By 1400, instead of having recovered to only 40 million people, the continent groans under the weight of 90 million souls. By 1450, over 100 million. This isn't cause for celebration, it's a recipe for catastrophe. You see, medieval agriculture has reached its absolute limit. Every technological innovation, the heavy plow, the 3-field system, water mills, has already been implemented. There's simply no more land to clear. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, which killed millions even before the plague, was a preview of what happens when population outstrips food supply. Now, without the plague's population reset, Europe enters a permanent state of Malthusian crisis. Famines become routine. occurring every 5 to 10 years instead of every generation. Peasants, instead of experiencing the post-plague labor shortage that gave them unprecedented bargaining power, remain trapped in desperate poverty. The average peasant in this timeline eats less, works more, and dies younger than in our plague-ravaged reality. Forests are stripped bare for fuel and farmland, leading to soil erosion and environmental collapse in many regions. Ironically, avoiding the Black Death may have created a slower, more prolonged form of suffering, a grinding poverty that touches every life, every day, for generations. Here's something that will change how you think about tragedy and progress forever. In our timeline, the Black Death created what historians call the golden age of the medieval laborer. With half the population dead, suddenly every surviving peasant, craftsman, and worker found themselves in a seller's market. Lords who once had 100 peasants competing for land now had 10 peasants and 90 empty fields. Wages doubled, then tripled. Serfs could demand freedom in exchange for their labor. Workers could, for the first time in centuries, simply walk away from bad lords and find employment elsewhere. This economic revolution shattered feudalism more effectively than any army or rebellion. It set in motion the rise of the merchant class, the growth of cities, the development of early capitalism. But in our plague-free timeline, none of this happens. The feudal system, instead of crumbling under labor shortages, strengthens. With desperate workers everywhere, lords can demand more for less. Serfdom, instead of gradually ending by 1500 as it did in Western Europe, persists well into the 17th or even 18th century. The middle class, the merchants, artisans, and free farmers who would become the engine of European progress, barely exists. Social mobility remains almost impossible. You are born a peasant, you die a peasant, and so will your children and their children for 20 generations. The very concept of upward mobility, of changing your station in life through work and skill, it simply doesn't exist in the European consciousness. Walk through the mental gallery of the Renaissance, and what do you see? Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical drawings, Michelangelo's David, Brunelleschi's dome, Gutenberg's printing press, the explosion of humanist philosophy that placed human potential at the center of thought. Now watch it all disappear. The Renaissance wasn't inevitable. It was the direct consequence of the social and economic upheaval caused by the plague. Wealthy Italian city-states, flush with inherited wealth from plague victims and new money from post-plague trade booms, became patrons of revolutionary art and thought. The printing press emerged in 1440 specifically because there was a newly literate merchant class hungry for books. Humanist scholars could challenge church dogma because the church's authority had been shattered by its inability to stop or explain the plague. Remove the Black Death, and these conditions never materialize. Art remains frozen in the Gothic tradition, beautiful, but formulaic and religious. Painting continues to follow Byzantine conventions rather than discovering perspective. Sculpture remains stylized rather than anatomically realistic. Most critically, the explosion of scientific thinking, the observation-based methodology that would lead to the scientific revolution, never escapes the straitjacket of Aristotelian philosophy and church control. The university system, instead of slowly opening to secular subjects, remains dominated by theology and canon law. It's not that no cultural advancement happens, it's that progress happens at a glacial pace, measured in centuries rather than decades. You need to understand something crucial about the Catholic Church before the Black Death. It was unquestionable. The Pope spoke with God's voice. Challenging church doctrine meant torture and death. The Inquisition operated with absolute authority. But then the plague came, and with it, the most devastating crisis the church ever faced. How could a just God allow such suffering? Why did priests die at the same rate as sinners? Why did prayers fail? These questions, whispered in millions of households, created the first widespread doubt about church authority in Western history. This doubt led directly to reform movements, which led to the Protestant Reformation, which shattered Christian unity forever. But without the plague, the church's authority never wavers. Martin Luther, born in this alternate 1483, never finds an audience for his critiques because the population hasn't spent a century and a half questioning why God abandoned them. The 95 Theses, if they're written at all, are condemned and forgotten. Luther likely burns as a heretic. The Reformation never happens. All of Europe remains Catholic. No Protestant work ethic. No religious wars that ironically advanced concepts of religious tolerance. No denominational competition that encouraged literacy so believers could read the Bible themselves. Christianity remains monolithic, unchanging, controlling. The separation of church and state, the concept of religious freedom, even the idea that religious authority can be questioned. These concepts, which we trace back to the Reformation and its aftermath, never enter European thought. Theological conformity, enforced by Inquisition and king, remains the norm for centuries longer than in our timeline. The irony will make you shudder. The worst pandemic in human history directly caused the revolution in medical science. Before the plague, medicine was based entirely on the ancient theories of Galen: 4 humors, bloodletting, and prayers. Doctors wore robes and debated Aristotle. They rarely touched actual patients. But the Black Death forced doctors to confront their absolute ignorance. Nothing they tried worked. Bleeding patients, they died. Special prayers, they died. Amulets and herbs, they died. This catastrophic failure forced a fundamental rethinking of medical philosophy. By the 1400s and 1500s, physicians began focusing on observation rather than ancient texts, on anatomy rather than theory. Andreas Vesalius's revolutionary anatomical studies in 1543 were only possible because post-plague Europe had normalized cutting open human bodies to understand disease. But in our plague-free timeline, medicine has no crisis to force its evolution. Galen's theories, wrong as they are, remain unchallengeable because they've never been catastrophically disproven. The medical profession remains primarily theoretical rather than practical. Anatomical study, considered heretical tampering with God's creation, advances at a snail's pace. The germ theory of disease, which required hundreds of years of incremental advances in microscopy, biology, and chemistry, might not emerge until the 1800s or even 1900s. Without this medical revolution, mortality rates remain staggeringly high. Childbirth continues killing 30% of mothers. Infections that we cure with antibiotics remain death sentences. Life expectancy, instead of climbing from 35 to 70 over 5 centuries, barely reaches 50 even in the modern era. Billions of people, across centuries, die needlessly because the Black Death never shocked medicine into progress. Let's talk about something everyone takes for granted: cities that don't reek of death. In our timeline, the plague terrified survivors into understanding that urban filth bred disease. The connection wasn't scientifically accurate, but the result was real. Post-plague European cities began, slowly and imperfectly, implementing sanitation measures. Waste management improved. Water sources were protected. The concept that public health required public action took root. This was the beginning, however faltering, of urban planning as we know it. Fast forward to this alternate timeline where the plague never arrived. Cities continue growing without check, but they remain medieval death traps. London, Paris, Florence, each swells to 2 or 3 times its historical population, but infrastructure remains primitive. Human waste flows through open gutters. Water sources become contaminated. Population density reaches levels that would shock even seasoned urban historians. Disease is constant, not pandemic but endemic. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis sweep through neighborhoods every year. Instead of occasional catastrophic plagues, you have continuous, grinding disease that kills 10 to 15% of urban populations annually. The very concept of the modern city, clean water, waste disposal, planned streets, develops centuries later, if at all. People accept disease and early death as simply the price of urban living. The public health movement, which in our timeline began as a response to industrialization building on post-plague sanitation concepts, never gets its philosophical foundation. Cities in this alternate 1800s resemble the worst slums of the worst Victorian London, except everywhere, with no reformers to challenge the status quo because clean cities were never part of European experience. History remembers the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Jacquerie in France, the German Peasants' War of 1524. What history often misses is why these rebellions became possible in the first place. Post-plague labor shortages had given peasants leverage, economic power they'd never possessed before. When lords tried to reimpose pre-plague conditions, peasants rebelled, knowing they had options, knowing their labor was valuable. Many of these rebellions were crushed, yes, but they fundamentally changed the relationship between labor and land. Lords learned they could no longer simply dictate terms. In our alternate timeline, peasant rebellions still happen. Desperation and injustice exist regardless, but they have a completely different character. Without economic leverage, without the memory of better conditions, these rebellions are born purely of starvation and hopelessness. They're more violent, more desperate, and far more easily crushed. A lord threatened by rebellion simply needs to wait. Starving peasants can't sustain resistance when there are 10 more families willing to take their land. The rebellions that do succeed tend to be bloodier and more destructive because that's the only way to achieve change. Instead of gradual reform, you get cycles of oppression and violent revolution. The concept of workers' rights, of negotiated improvements in conditions, never develops organically. Rights are only won through bloodshed, if at all. Fast forward to the 19th century, and labor movements in this timeline resemble the worst excesses of Russian serfdom right up until revolution rather than the gradual reforms that characterized much of Western Europe. Violence begets violence, and without the plague's economic shock to break the cycle, the relationship between labor and capital remains fundamentally adversarial for centuries longer. Picture the map of 1500 in our timeline. Portuguese sailors have rounded Africa, Columbus has reached the Americas, the age of exploration is in full swing. Now erase it. The age of exploration wasn't driven by curiosity or adventure, it was driven by economics and opportunity. Post-plague Europe had surplus capital, a merchant class seeking investment opportunities, and technological advances funded by new wealth. Labor shortages had driven innovations in navigation and shipbuilding. You need better ships when you have fewer sailors. But in our no-plague Europe, the economics look completely different. Capital isn't available for risky voyages. It's tied up feeding an overpopulated continent. The merchant class barely exists. Technological innovation proceeds at a crawl. Most critically, there's no economic incentive for exploration. Why risk voyages to unknown lands when you can't even feed the population you have? When there's no land available in Europe, there's no concept of colonizing new continents. Portuguese exploration of Africa, if it happens at all, is limited to coastal trading posts. Columbus likely never gets funding. The Spanish crown is dealing with internal famines and social unrest, not financing speculative ventures. The Americas, therefore, remain isolated for another century, perhaps two. When European contact finally comes, the demographic catastrophe for indigenous peoples might be even worse. They've had less time to develop any resistance to Old World diseases, and they face a Europe even more desperate for resources than in our timeline. Alternatively, some historians argue that a delayed age of exploration might have allowed indigenous civilizations to develop to a point where they could resist European colonization entirely, fundamentally changing the entire modern world map. Here's a question that should terrify you. How many innovations exist only because someone somewhere faced a crisis that forced them to think differently? The printing press, which revolutionized human knowledge, was developed partly because post-plague Europe had a literate merchant class creating demand for books that hand copying couldn't satisfy. Mechanical clocks became widespread because labor-short monasteries needed to coordinate prayers with fewer monks. Improved agricultural techniques emerged from necessity when fewer farmers had to feed more people. These aren't just gadgets. They're the building blocks of modernity, and in our alternate timeline, the incentives to develop them don't exist. Technology doesn't stop completely, but it advances at a fundamentally different pace. The printing press might be invented a century later, limiting its revolutionary impact. Mechanical innovation remains concentrated in military applications. That's where monarchs invest money, rather than spreading to civil society. The concept of labor-saving devices, which seems obvious to us, makes no sense in a world with perpetual labor surplus. Why develop a machine when 10 men will do the work cheaper? Water-powered mills, windmills, early mechanical devices all develop slower or not at all. The implications compound over time. By the time this alternate timeline reaches what should be the Industrial Revolution, it's not ready. The scientific foundation is weaker, the culture of innovation is absent, the capital accumulation necessary for industrialization never happened. You might have an alternate 1800 that looks more like our 1600, and an alternate 1900 that resembles our 1750. The modern world, with all its technology, might be delayed by 200, 300 years. Everyone alive in this alternate 2025 is living a life that, in our timeline, resembles the early 20th century at best. Let me tell you about something that rarely makes it into alternative history discussions: the evolution of women's roles in society, and how the Black Death accidentally advanced it by centuries. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, with half the population dead, women suddenly found themselves running businesses, managing estates, practicing trades previously reserved for men. Guild restrictions relaxed out of necessity. Women became brewers, merchants, even doctors in some regions. This wasn't equality, but it was unprecedented opportunity. These gains eroded over the following centuries, yes, but they planted seeds. The concept that women could perform skilled labor, manage commerce, contribute economically beyond domestic work. Now consider our alternate timeline. With population pressures constant and labor never scarce, there's zero incentive to expand women's economic roles. If anything, social restrictions intensify. More children are needed to ensure some survive to adulthood, meaning women spend even more of their lives pregnant and raising children. Education for women, already limited, becomes virtually non-existent. Why educate someone whose entire life will be childbearing and domestic work? The early feminist writers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, who built on post-plague social disruptions, never find intellectual footing. Christine de Pisan's revolutionary writings in the early 1400s defending women's capabilities likely never happened. She only became a writer because the plague killed her husband and left her to support her family through her work. Without such precedents, the women's suffrage movement, the feminist revolutions of the 20th century, all get delayed or fundamentally altered. An alternate 2025 might have women's rights resembling our 1920s or earlier. Gender equality, which we see as a progressive evolution, might instead be viewed in this timeline as a dangerous, radical impossibility. Half the human population, constrained not just by law but by centuries of unbroken tradition that was never shock disrupted by plague. Here's something that will change your perspective on environmental history. The Black Death was, accidentally, the greatest conservation event in European history. When half the population died, millions of acres of farmland returned to forest. Overworked soil recovered. Exhausted fisheries replenished. Hunted-out game populations rebounded. Species that were near extinction, wolves, bears, wild boar, recovered in the depopulated landscape. The European environment in 1400 was actually healthier than it had been in 1300. Nature had been given a terrible, unintentional reprieve. Now imagine continuous population growth without that reset. By 1400, every major forest in Western Europe is gone, completely cleared for farmland and fuel. Soil erosion has turned formerly productive land into wasteland, the Dust Bowl, but medieval and across an entire continent. Game animals are extinct across vast regions. Rivers are toxic with urban waste and industrial processes like tanning and dyeing. The air in cities is unbreathable from wood smoke, and wood is already scarce, causing an energy crisis. By 1500, Europe faces the environmental collapse that in our timeline took until the 19th century to approach. The consequences are catastrophic. Famines aren't occasional, they're constant, as degraded land produces less food each year. Firewood becomes so expensive that people burn anything combustible, including structural timbers from their own homes. The concept of environmental conservation never develops because there's no nature left to conserve. It's all been consumed by immediate survival needs. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, whenever it finally occurs, and it happens in a landscape already ecologically devastated. The environmental problems we face in our 2025 might be exponentially worse in this alternate timeline, because the industrial age is built on top of centuries of additional environmental destruction. Climate change, deforestation, pollution, all accelerated by centuries of unchecked population pressure. Walk through the hallowed halls of Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, Bologna, institutions that defined Western intellectual tradition for centuries. Now understand this. Their golden age was the direct result of the Black Death's aftermath. Before the plague, universities were tiny, conservative institutions focused almost exclusively on training clergy, perhaps a few hundred students across all of Europe. But post-plague wealth, social mobility, and the need for educated administrators in a transformed economy caused explosive growth. Universities expanded their curriculum beyond theology to include law, medicine, natural philosophy. The student body diversified beyond the clergy to include merchant sons, minor nobility, even talented peasants. This was the foundation of the intellectual revolution that would eventually produce the Enlightenment, our alternate timeline. Universities remain small, conservative, and dominated by the church. Student populations stay in the hundreds rather than thousands. Curriculum remains focused on theology and canon law because that's all the church-controlled institutions will teach. Natural philosophy, what we would call science, remains a tiny subdiscipline of theology, focused on reconciling observation with Scripture rather than understanding nature on its own terms. Critically, the expansion of literacy never happens. In our timeline, literacy rates in Europe grew from perhaps 5% in 1300 to 30% by 1600. This created the informed public that made democracy conceivable. But without the economic changes that made literacy valuable, without the printing press making books affordable, literacy remains the preserve of a tiny elite. An alternate 1900 might have literacy rates around 20%. The implications for democracy, human rights, scientific progress, everything we associate with modernity, are staggering. You can't have an age of enlightenment when 90% of the population can't read. You can't have popular sovereignty when the public is illiterate. The modern world requires an educated population, and without the Black Death's disruptions, universal education might not exist even today. The greatest art is born from suffering, they say. It's a romantic notion, but in the case of post-plague Europe, it's verifiable truth. The Renaissance explosion in art, the emotional realism of Giotto, the technical mastery of Van Eyck, the philosophical depth of Leonardo, emerged from a civilization that had stared into the abyss and survived. Artists who had watched their families die brought an unprecedented emotional intensity to their work. Patrons who had inherited plague fortunes funded artistic innovation as a form of defiance against death. The very concept of individual human worth, which underpins Renaissance humanism, emerged partly from plague-era questions about the value of human life. Remove the plague and European art advances, but slowly, incrementally, along established traditions. Gothic art remains dominant through the 1500s, perhaps longer. The revolution in perspective, in anatomical realism, in emotional expression, all delayed or diminished. But the greatest loss isn't in masterpieces, it's in the democratization of culture. Post-plague economic changes created a merchant class with money to commission art, read literature, attend theater. culture escaped the exclusive control of church and nobility. In our no-plague timeline, culture remains aristocratic. The Globe Theatre doesn't exist because there's no middle class to attend plays. Shakespeare, if he's born at all, likely remains an illiterate Glover in Stratford because there's no economic path for a commoner to become a writer. Cervantes, Dante, Chaucer. The literature we consider foundational to Western civilization either doesn't exist or exists only in ecclesiastical Latin, read by a tiny elite. The novel, the newspaper, public theater, accessible music, all the culture that defines modern life remains locked away behind social barriers. An alternate modern world where culture is still primarily for the wealthy, where the masses have no voice, no representation in art, no ability to tell their own stories. Cultural stagnation that mirrors and reinforces social stagnation. Zoom out to the global scale and watch the entire world map redraw itself. In our timeline, post-plague European nations, despite having smaller populations than before 1347, somehow became the dominant global powers by 1700. How? Superior technology, economic systems, and social structures, all products of the post-plague transformation. They conquered the Americas, colonized Africa, dominated trade with Asia. European dominance was so complete that by 1900, European powers and their colonial offshoots controlled over 85% of the Earth's land surface. In our alternate timeline, European global dominance might never happen, or it might happen completely differently. A Europe locked in feudalism, environmental crisis, and technological stagnation isn't in a position to conquer anybody. Instead, you might see the continued dominance of Asian powers. The Ottoman Empire, Safavid Persia, Ming and Qing China, Mughal India, these civilizations weren't affected by the Black Death's European outbreak. In our timeline, they remained powerful until European technological and economic advantages overwhelmed them in the 18th and 19th centuries. But if Europe never gets those advantages, the world in 1800 might have Istanbul, not London or Paris, as the dominant global power center. Beijing might be the world's financial capital instead of New York. Alternative timeline historians might study the European stagnation as a curious regional phenomenon, wondering why this one continent never achieved its potential while Asian and Middle Eastern civilizations advanced. Or, and this is darker, you might have no dominant global power. Instead of European colonialism, you might have ongoing multipolar conflicts, constant warfare between relatively equal powers, no Pax Britannica to impose global trade rules. The 20th century world wars might start in the 16th century and never really end. Either way, the world map in 2025 looks nothing like ours. Different borders, different languages, different power structures, different everything. Let's bring it home to today. Imagine you're alive in the alternate 2025, the world that would exist if the Black Death never reached Europe. What does your life look like? Statistically, you're not European or of European descent. That's our first clue that things are radically different. The American continents were colonized much later, if at all, and certainly not by massive waves of European immigrants. Your technology is advanced, but perhaps 25 to 50 years behind our timeline. No smartphones yet, maybe rudimentary internet. Medical care resembles our 1990s. Democracy, if it exists in your region, is younger and less established. Perhaps your country just overthrew its monarchy in the 1970s or 1980s. Your social mobility is limited. You'll probably die in the same social class you were born into. If you're a woman, your rights are severely restricted. Maybe you just got the vote in your lifetime. Environmental conditions are worse. Pollution, deforestation, climate change accelerated by centuries of additional degradation. But here's what's really different: the entire conception of human potential. In our world, we believe in progress, in improvement, in the ability of human effort to change circumstances. That belief was born from the post-plague era when people saw their world fundamentally transformed. In this alternate world, where change happens slowly if at all, People believe in fate, in fixed social orders, in accepting circumstances. The very idea that things could be better, that technology could improve lives, that social conditions could change, that individual effort matters. These ideas might not exist. You live in a world where "that's how it's always been" isn't just an observation, it's a philosophy. This is the world we avoided because rats on ships brought a disease that killed 50 million people. The question that should haunt you: were we lucky, or did we pay an unthinkable price for the modern world we take for granted? Scientists call it sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Change one variable, one ship sinks instead of arriving at port, and 600 years later, everything is different. But here's what keeps historians awake at night. The butterfly effect works both ways. If the Black Death was ultimately beneficial to European development, and the evidence suggests it was, does that mean catastrophes can be good? It's a morally repugnant idea, but the historical record doesn't care about our moral comfort. 50 million people died horrible deaths. Entire villages were wiped out. Children watched their parents die. Parents watched their children die. The suffering was unimaginable. And yet, out of that crucible came the modern world. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, democracy, human rights, modern medicine. The entire edifice of contemporary civilization rests on foundations laid in the post-plague era. We are the beneficiaries of other people's unthinkable suffering. This creates a philosophical puzzle that has no comfortable answer. Would you push a button that prevented the Black Death if you knew it would delay or prevent all subsequent human advancement? 50 million lives saved, but potentially billions denied the benefits of modernity, living in conditions of medieval poverty and oppression for centuries longer. There's no right answer. The point isn't to celebrate catastrophe, it's to recognize that history is not a story of linear progress, of inevitable advancement toward enlightenment. History is chaos and contingency, shaped by random events that cascade through time in unpredictable ways. The modern world isn't humanity's destiny. It's an unlikely outcome, shaped by circumstances that could easily have been different. We live in one possible timeline among infinite alternatives, and the factors that brought us here were often beyond human control or intention. So where does this leave us? We've walked through a world that never existed, explored a timeline where 50 million people lived who died in hours, where feudalism persisted, where the Renaissance never ignited, where modernity was delayed by centuries. We've seen how a single pandemic, terrible as it was, accidentally unlocked human potential in ways that peaceful prosperity never could. And now you have to live with this knowledge. Every freedom you enjoy, every technology you use, every social advance you benefit from, they have roots, somewhere in their genealogy, in the catastrophe of 1346 to 1353. History isn't simple. It isn't a story of good triumphing over evil, of inevitable human progress, of suffering always being meaningless. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, catastrophe creates opportunity. Crisis forces innovation. Suffering prompts questioning that leads to wisdom. This doesn't make suffering good. Don't misunderstand. The Black Death was a horror beyond comprehension, but it was a horror that accidentally broke a stagnant system, created space for new ideas, forced humanity to question everything it thought it knew. The alternate world we explored today, the world without the plague, might have found other paths to progress. Slower, different paths, or it might have remained locked in medieval patterns for centuries longer. We'll never know. What we do know is this: the world you live in, with all its flaws and promises, is the contingent result of countless past events, including terrible ones. Your life, your freedom, your opportunities, your very existence, is downstream from choices and chances you'll never know about. History isn't something that happened to other people. It's the water we swim in, invisible but shaping everything. The next time you face catastrophe, remember this: endings create beginnings. When one world dies, another becomes possible. The question isn't whether change will come, it's whether we'll be wise enough to shape it. The Black Death couldn't be prevented or controlled, But its aftermath was shaped by human choices, human courage, human vision. That's always been our power, not to prevent catastrophe, but to decide what comes after. What will you build from the ruins you inherit?